seminar today. So welcome to the Accounting Design Project. We're really excited to have you here. Thank you to Ayung and Stephen for organizing this series. We have a really exciting speaker and a paper today. So Gil is going to be presenting. I think he needs no introduction. He's been involved in aggregate level research since its earliest days. I asked him for one fun fact, and he gave me two fun facts. So he's quite an overachiever here. The first is that he's a big soccer fan, and the second is that he may be the only one this morning who knows who D. Sol is. So I have no idea who that is or what that is, so I'm intrigued. Just a few ground rules. If you have a question, just write the word question in the chat box, and I'll interrupt Gil and tell you have a question. And you can, please unmute yourself and ideally, if you're comfortable, sort of share your video so we kind of know who you are. All right, well, without further ado, take it away, Gil.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for joining us this morning, and thanks the organizer for allowing us to present the paper. And again, this is joint work with Ronnie, which I think a lot of you know as well, and my brother, and Ayung, who is one of the organizers. So thank you for allowing us to present your own work. So one of the, I think it's probably the longest lasting result in accounting is there's a positive association between earnings and returns, and it's the earnings changes. It started off from my advisor back in '68, and it's still true till today. So those results still hold. And actually, we're not even arguing with that. But the question is, what happens is over time, we see a decline that this relation has weakened a little bit over time. And then there's a debate of whether this means that earnings loses its relevance or not. And that's, again, why it was in quotation, because we're not really dealing with that question, but we are dealing with the decline. And so this is kind of one specification that we run, and this is the cross-sectional regression. So we run a return on earnings growth regression. So return on IT on delta X, which is changes earnings in the same period, cross-sectionally, and we plot the R squareds. And you can see that the relationship is declining, and in the last few periods, it's last 2 years, it's really low. But this also gets us to, I think, the main point of the paper, which is to some degree, it's not even not related to our results that I'm going to show you, is that most studies analyze the cross-sectional earnings relationship. So really what they're looking at is if firm A has higher earnings than firm B, or earnings growth in this case, does firm A have higher stock returns than firm B? We're okay with that. It's an important research question to ask. But by definition, when you run these cross-sectional regressions, you exclude all the commonalities. So you exclude the fact if A and B both of them have 5% earnings growth, that's excluded. So if that affects stock prices in any way, we don't get to measure that, because all we're looking at is the differences between these two firms. And so it excludes the systematic component, or excludes the common components of earnings or earnings growth, again, when we measure those these relationships. So again, what we do in our paper is, I'm sorry, I think I skipped a few. So an alternative specification, one that has been used on occasion, not a lot. So I think it starts with Tietz and Wastley. Ronnie and I in our paper together, we did time series. Jung Ho, Choi, and Alon Kalai and I also did that. But there's also the firm level analysis. Now, firm level analysis is a little bit different. So it's firm level time series. So it compares the firm to itself. So that means if a firm has higher earnings and today, more than it usually has, does the firm has higher stock returns than it usually has? And the advantage of the time series, it has disadvantages as well, but the advantages of time series is that the common component is measured as well. So if all firms are up by 5%, that's still in the time series regression, because I'm not taking those relationships out. So the time series relation allows us to examine the systematic component of earnings and returns as well. So it incorporates that as well. So those questions are fundamentally different. I'm not advocating one versus the other. In fact, what we're advocating, and I think this is, again, before I show you results, there's a conceptual point here that I think is broader than our results. I don't think it's necessarily related to what I'm about to show you. If we're trying to understand the earnings returns relation in any context, I mean, it could be the value relevance, it could be something else, conservatism, or anything else you want to do, you need a complete analysis of the earnings returns relation over time. So that means you need cross-sectional analysis. You need to see, again, what happens to one firm compared to the other. You need the time series analysis to incorporate, again, how the firm does over time, and including the aggregate, because I want to see what's going on. Again, if all firms are up by 5%, okay, every single one of them, the cross-sectional analysis won't even work. It won't converge. There's going to be no cross-sectional variation at all. But that doesn't mean that earnings and returns don't have a relationship. It will be captured in the aggregate relationship between earnings and returns. So what we need, if you want to look at the earnings returns relation, you need basically the cross-sectional analysis, the firm level time series analysis, and the aggregate level time series analysis. So if I'm trying to understand what's going on, I need to look at the whole picture. And I think that's not, again, that's unrelated to what I've shown you before. I think it's more of a conceptual point. They're all part of the earnings returns relation, and to understand all of it, and again, be able to compare the importance of idiosyncratic versus systematic earnings over time, you need to look at the whole picture. And that's pretty much what we started off in this study. I will be lying if I tell you all of the results that are coming up right now I expected. So to be fair, I think all three of us were kind of surprised by some of the results that we found afterwards. So just to summarize, I don't want to repeat myself too much, but when you run firm level time series, the idiosyncratic earnings are basically that. Idiosyncratic means firm level kind of independent variation is incorporated and taken into consideration. The same thing goes in firm level cross-sectional, but, and I'm warning you below, it's not the same relationship, right? We talked about it. The cross-sectional compares one firm to the other, and the time series compares the firm to itself over time. So even though both of them capture the idiosyncratic component, they capture it in a different way. Now, the systematic component of earnings is incorporated when we run firm level time series and when we run the aggregate time series, but the cross-sectional analysis completely excludes it. So any common variation in earnings is not included in our analysis when we use those, when we use cross-sectional regressions. Again, we do obviously incorporate firm level returns when we run firm level studies, and on the aggregate, we incorporate the aggregate returns. Sorry. So let's see how the whole relationship looks like. So I started off showing you what most of the literature has done. It's the cross-sectional regressions, and we saw that it's going down. And so now let's look at the aggregate. And I should mention there's a paper preceding us in REST. I don't know, I think it's forthcoming, that is showing some of this ahead of us. So Kim and all. And so what we show is, if you look at the beginning period, you can see that the relation between earnings returns is negative. And then it increases over time to positive and continuously increasing. So let me just explain what we run first to make sure that we're all on the same page. So we run aggregate earnings return relationship with 20-year rolling windows. So that's why we start in 1982. So it starts from 62 to 82. Then we run, that's the first R squared. And then it's kind of rolling window. We add one more year. And as you can see, again, it starts off negative, and slowly over time, it starts moving positive and increasing over time. And so we're already seeing that the cross-sectional relation and the aggregate relation are actually moving in opposite directions, right? The cross-sectional was going down, the aggregate is actually increasing in importance. So we also tried an additional specification. We don't do it throughout the paper because once you add a lot of variables, some of the incremental stuff becomes a bit more complicated. So we run returns on earnings and changes in earnings, and you see there's a bit more of a jump, but It starts positive all the time, but it does increase at the same kind of time period. As you can see, again, there's seems to be around the early 2000s, somewhere to mid to 2007, somewhere where there's been a shift and the relationship is becoming positive. I should also note we do take out the crisis periods and we get the same trend to a lesser degree, but we get the same trend. So what about the firm level time series? Let's be complete. Let's look at the whole relationship. And oops, sorry, that was my watch. So if you run the firm level time series, so what we do here is we run for every firm. Let me again explain what we're running. So for every firm, we run the regression of returns on earnings growth. And right, so if we have, let's say, 600 firms in the sample with 20 years, then we run the analysis for those firms, and we get, let's say, for 600 firms, we get 600 coefficients, 600 R squareds. And then we use the mean or the average of the R squareds. We use medians as well as robustness. Pretty much the pictures look the same. So if you look at means of R squareds over time, it's somewhat flat. So there is a little bit of an increase there at the beginning of the period after a brief decline, but it's somewhat flat. I mean, it's not moving that much. And we do have a little bit of an increase, and we tried this different specification. We use, again, earnings and increase in earnings. Although I would mention again, I mean, the economic significance of the increase is not that strong. So I'm just going to show you a table that summarizes what we've seen before, and just with a bit of a show you that the changes are statistically significant, although I think it's fairly obvious from the slides. So if you look at the left hand of the papers, we have cross-sectional regressions and excluding financial and including financials. I'll explain that in a minute. And what you see is, again, cross-sectional negative coefficient of minus 12%, and they're all significant. So that's that decline that we saw in the cross-sectional analysis. The time series analysis, that's where you get a very strong positive coefficient. And this is why we exclude financial. So the Kim et al. Paper showed a relationship between financial firms and the increase in the earnings returns relation. And you can see that when you exclude the financials, it goes from 1.47 to 0.84. So there is a difference. And so we definitely have, again, a very strong increase in the earnings returns relation for the aggregate. And when you run firm level time series, you see this, that there is an increase and it's significant, but the economic significance is not that strong. So that's why I said it's fairly stable and with a mild increase in explanatory power on the time series.
Gil, I don't want to interrupt, but there's a question in the chat box.
Absolutely.
Penguo Wang has two questions.
Where's the? There it is. Okay.
No.
Yes, Jake Thomas knows who Diesel is. I'm impressed. How many observations are included in your regressions? So that's a good point. So let me, so what we do, and I think what you're alluding to is that we have a sample selection issue. So we need firms to have 15 to 20 observations to run it. So we tried everything with 15 years, it's the same results. But we think 20 is a bit more robust, so we did that, but it's exactly the same trends. There's no real difference. And what we did is we also did with a constant sample. So we run firms where the aggregate and the cross-sectional and the time series are all run with the same firms, so that we are not capturing just a changing composition of firms in the sample. And I think that's what you're getting at, and I think that's a good point. The problem when you're running time series is you're only including firms that were there for at least 15 to 20 years. So by definition, you're incorporating older firms. Or the ones that have been there for a longer period of time, at least in the capital markets. So that selection does exist, but we try to fix that by just using a what I would say a constant sample where all the firms that are employed in all of the analysis are the same firms. So the cross-sectional, the time series, and the aggregates have the same sample in them, and we get the exact same result. So I don't think it's driving our results, but it is somewhat of a concern. I agree. Okay.
Gil, that's a question for you. So, do we have any kind of idea what we should expect to see, like on average?
As I said, I have an ex post explanation. Can I say that we expected the results that we were going to find? Some of it because of prior studies. I had a feeling that we'll get something, but for example, the firm level time series, I had no idea what I'll find. The aggregate, I had a feeling that it will move a little, but not that it would be that straight up. The persistence result, I didn't know I would get. I mean, it's really, I had no expectations that this would be the findings that we'll find. In fact, we spent a lot of time trying to figure out after we found it why that's happening.
Right. Yeah.
The genesis of the paper is just that we started noticing that earnings, just as anecdotally, that earnings don't seem to matter that much anymore. And like, at least or anecdotally, and we started off, let's see what's going on, because it's, you know, it doesn't really take, it's anecdotally, it's not really, so let's see. And we did see the decline in the cross-sectional, and when we examined all the rest, we found everything else. And that's kind of where
I think it's really interesting, you know, and I think we chatted a little bit about this, that Baruch loves, you know, the title of his book is The End of Accounting, right? And so there's this idea that, you know, accounting is becoming less value relevant, and there's the rise of these KPIs, right? The non-financial stuff is somehow, you know, there's these arguments about how that stuff is becoming more important, and I don't know if you have any thoughts or perspective on kind of how that fits here.
Well, actually, I actually do agree that key performance indicators and other things are very important. And you can see the differences between analyst forecasts, for example, and earnings and other things that we've done. But I think one of the reasons why we've basically said the end of accounting and all is going back to, we just ignored. If you look at the time series, it's the same. If anything, it's increasing a little. So let's not kill accounting that fast. That's one of the things we're saying. We need to look at the whole thing first before we start making conclusions on the whole. Now, to be fair, if you went back 20 years to some of when that was done, I mean, it would have been very difficult to run some of those time series analysis. So, and it's why we started with cross-sectional, really. It gave us, we had the sample to do it. But now that we have longer time series and we can examine things more broadly, I think one of the conclusions that we're making here is that the aggregate is becoming more important while firm level is becoming less. That doesn't matter. That doesn't mean that earnings have changed anything, or it seems that they have, but it's not necessarily an earnings characteristic. It could be a market characteristic that is not related to earnings, and I think there's evidence to suggest that that's part of what's going on. And again, we're running the same regressions we used to, and we're getting the same conclusions. And I don't think that's where we should go. That's if anything, I would say is in that way that the first slides that we came in, the methodology one, the one that says we have to look at the whole three, that's one of our main points. Let's look at the whole three, and then we can make decisions. Maybe accounting is dead, but you need the whole picture before you make those conclusions. But actually, on the other point, I do agree that there's a lot of other sources of information, and I do think they're important. Okay. Yeah, thank you, Ayung. So, Christine. Okay, thank you, Christine. So just to recap, we've got three different relationships. So the cross-sectional is going down. The firm level time series is somewhat stable, maybe slightly increasing. And the aggregate returns relation is increasing from a negative relation to a positive relation. So kind of, so what's going on? So it's not just our research question, it's also, again, a real question because we didn't know that we'll find it. So really curious about what's going on. So the first thing we thought of was changes in timeliness. So the first thought that we had is that basically predictability has improved. So things are becoming more predictable or less predictable in the aggregate, and that's what's changing things. We can't find it. So we do find a few changes in timeliness, but in some cases it's working in the opposite direction, and the aggregate doesn't show a consistent trend. It is a bit lower in the later periods, but it's the relationship is it's not even a U shape. There's some going ups and downs. So we just can't find anything related to timeliness that is affecting our results in terms of, I would say, earnings predictability, maybe not timeliness. Timeliness is used in a different way, but earnings predictability doesn't seem to explain these trends that we're seeing, or at least not in a way that we can fully understand. I should mention that, for example, forecast errors, unpredictable forecast errors is fairly positive throughout the time periods if we do it quarterly. So on the aggregate. So there are things related to predictability, but we can't explain our trends with predictability. But so first, what we're trying to figure out, if the time series is flat, which incorporates the systematic where the aggregate is going up and the cross-sectional, which is only idiosyncratic, is going down. So maybe what's going on the firm level time series is two different forces, that the idiosyncratic risk, or sorry, I shouldn't say risks, idiosyncratic earnings or firm level earnings are becoming a little bit less, I don't know if to say important, but they're losing their explanatory power while the aggregate earnings are increasing them. So what we run is if you look at model 1 on the slides, we run returns, firm level returns, again, this is time series, on firm level earnings growth and aggregate earnings growth. So for every firm, we put its own earnings and the aggregate. So basically, if you want to think about it, alpha 2, it captures the idiosyncratic component or the firm level one, and alpha 3 will capture the macro. And then we run models 2 and 3. So basically what we're trying to figure out is the incremental R squared of the aggregate earnings versus the firm level earnings. So the left-hand side here on the slide is basically, it's the incremental component of the idiosyncratic component. So how much does firm level, apart from excluding the market, is contributing versus on the right-hand side, you see the aggregate market. And what you're seeing is basically a decline, especially starting from 1993, a fairly monotonic decline in the importance of firm level earnings. So the adjusted R squared on aggregate it's just this nice declining trend. And I think so that one is more consistent with the cross-sectional results that it is declining. So we're seeing this decline in the incremental R squared of firm level earnings, but on the right-hand side, you were seeing what the aggregate or the co-movement across firms, and that component is rising. So it's rising from a negative. Again, we use the signed R squared. So if alpha 3 is negative, then we negative the R squared. And you can see that it's slowly increasing from a negative to a positive and becoming, again, more important over time. So it's a fairly consistent trend going upwards on aggregate earnings. So clearly the relationship between earnings and returns is changing. I don't know if I would say declining. I mean, in some cases it's declining, in some cases it's increasing, in some cases it's flat. So hard to figure that out, but definitely on the aggregate side, it is changing. Okay, I would use the word changing rather than increasing because it moves from negative to positive, but it's completely changing the relationship between, again, idiosyncratic returns and systematic earnings.
Sorry, Gil, two questions in the chat box, one from Steve Penman and Lei Shu.
Yes, why isn't book value in the regression? I mean, accounting is a double entry system, and we have a basic rule, you can't look at earnings without having book value, it's double entry. And for that matter, there's a whole lot of line items. For example, if you took out the expense investment, R&D out of earnings, how would that change it? There's a lot of work showing that has indicated that the quality of earnings, information of earnings has declined because of that. It seemed like a very too simple regression given our double entry system and the line items we generate from that system.
To a large degree, I actually agree. I mean, the problem that we have is, and you saw we added the earnings level, for example, as another robustness. If I start adding a lot of variables, the incremental analysis becomes quite difficult. So I can look at coefficients in some cases, but the coefficients have an issue of variations. So for example, the reason why we use R squares and not coefficients is because if the dispersion rises, which it has, it will lower the coefficient. So I mean, I get where you're coming from, and I think that's fine to look at the book values as well. We're just looking at earnings in this analysis. We can add another complete analysis. We'll have to separate it. I don't know how to put all of this in the same regression and make that completely work. I'm not saying again, it's a complete analysis of the role of accounting in markets. All I have is earnings. By excluding book values, by definition, I've excluded basically a part of accounting that is a big part, the book value and the double entry system, as you said, from the analysis. It's just I don't know if it's a cop out, but I mean empirically, I just have a hard time adding all of those into the regression and making sense out of it.
I don't understand adding book value would give you problems. I mean, it's all a question of a specification to get your inferences right. And it seems to me you've got to get a specification that represents the accounting system. And you have earnings changes in the old style of, Ball and Brown, it's earnings changes, but it's actually earnings levels that add to book value, okay? Mm-hmm. The Easton Harris work shows that no, the earnings levels are very important, and particularly when deflated on price. So, we have to ask whether you do have the specification here to really answer the question.
The only thing I can say, when I add just earnings itself, that I think I could do in some of the analysis, it will be hard here. Then we get pretty similar inferences. So we did do that. But now if I add earnings levels and book values, it became a little bit too much for us to wrap our hand around. So basically, that's why we said in the title, it's earnings. When we want to get to, and I think this is what I agree with you, Stephen, on the role of accounting overall, we're lacking because the book values are not there. And you're right on the specification, right? Is it by adding book values, by adding earnings levels, you're also controlling for the expected earnings components. So I take the point on that a lot. Again, I mean, I think it's somewhat of a cop-out, but I just have a hard time if I have a big regression to start showing all this analysis. I think we're making a point about, and you'll see some of the other things that we're making a point about how earnings changed, but we have a lot of problems on aggregating it to how the role of accounting overall in capital markets. I think we're lacking there because of it.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks, Gil.
Am I missing a question? Anyway, if I'm missing a question, let me know. I think I am. How do you control for the scale effect? Well, in the returns earnings growth, I don't think we have those scale effects. I think you're correct me if I'm wrong, Lei, but I think you're referring to the Tom Lee's paper. I think about the scale issues I think we don't have those issues in our regression model. We've tried other things to deal with scale. You can remind me of exactly what we've done, but I don't think those are issues in our analysis here.
Yeah, so the Tom Lee's paper is about per share. So there's a scale effect issue using the earnings per share, book value per share on the right-hand side. And here the scale is the beginning market capitalization. We also tried the beginning total assets. The market cap is the correct one to use because our dependent variable is return, which is the beginning market cap as a denominator.
Thank you. So again, I like tests that actually show the significance of things, although I think it's pretty clear in the graphs. So what we look at the incremental R squared of firm level earnings, and you can see that decline, the negative coefficient of -0.02, for example. again, when you include financial firms, it's not as significant, but it's there. And the incremental R squared of aggregate earnings is increasing. Here is it's a good point for me to start making make this following statement. The decline in firm level, and I think this gets to Stephen's points, in different specifications in other places is not as steep. So if you, for example, use operating income, it's not as steep. If you lose analyst forecast errors, I think it's almost flat. But the increase of the importance of aggregate, that one is fairly consistent throughout specifications. So, and I think what we'll spend most of our time is actually on that increase in the aggregate afterwards as well. But it seems that this idiosyncratic component is related to more transitory issues in accounting, and at least to some degree, because it's declining afterwards a little bit as well. But so at least to some degree, it's related to it. Yes, I agree, Christine. There's other papers that look again that there's been switching in accounting between book values and return and earnings and things like that as well. I do agree that again, that's the point of versus accounting information versus earnings that we're doing. So I think the other studies, when they include the book values and do all the rest, they are better off at explaining the whole role of accounting rather than we're just kind of stuck with earnings. But I mean, I'm just I don't like this answer, but just in terms of how many different slides, how many different trends am I going to be able to show in graphs with I have all of these regressions and there is not there. So the way to view our paper is only about earnings. We can't make the statement about accounting overall, and I think that's a bit of a maybe disappointing, but I just think that's more of a practical consideration that we're using here. So again, so if we summarize the firm levels, that the cross-sectional earnings returns relation is declining. The time series is flat or slightly rising. It's again, because of the idiosyncratic component is becoming, I don't know if to say less important or less value relevance. Again, I don't know again what you want to use the term for, but the aggregate is changing and increasing over time. So let's look at persistence, right? We were looking, basically the way we started off is we found those interesting results and we didn't know what to make of them. And we started to think about all sorts of what's going on ourselves. So we went through the classical explanations. One of them was timeliness or predictability. The other one was persistence. And so what we run here is, again, we run the same regression. So let me again explain what we run. We're running earnings growth for the firm on prior firm's earnings growth and prior aggregate earnings growth. Okay, so we run delta 1 times the firm level. So it's looking for the firm level persistence. And I don't know if to say the aggregate level persistence, because I don't know if that's accurate, but basically what we're looking at is how important is the aggregate earnings in explaining future firm level earnings. And what you can see is I think that the left is not surprising. I think we've seen that before. So to me, the magnitude is a bit surprising. So the firm level persistence of earnings growth is, I shouldn't even use the word persistence. It's negative, which means it's not persistent. And it's really high. So I think it reaches in the lower period somewhere between about minus 27, 0.27, which means, again, if you've got a good year, it flips. The next year, you're likely to have a bad year. Again, cross-sectionally. So what it means is basically the firm level performance is not sticky. So firms, if there is an advantage, the firm loses it. So again, it does get to some literature on competition rising, which I should mention. So that's, I think, what the, all right, and I take your point, Stephen, when you increase in the book values, you're lowering the persistence of earnings. I agree. And when you look at aggregates, it's the opposite picture. So, I mean, it did start off a little bit negative and it switches positive pretty quickly and it's rising all the time. So, I mean, just it's a mirror image, and you can see as the firm level results are less important, the cove movement is becoming more important. it's kind of what we're seeing here. And I think this is, I actually think this is the key result in the paper, is because it's not just returns. So one of the issues when you look at return earnings relation is that you're not just capturing accounting, you're also capturing investors. Right? Because if investors behave in a certain way, you'll affect the earnings returns relation, even if earnings stay exactly the same. So if I change the group of investors, let's say to more efficient ones, the earnings returns relation will change, even if nothing else changes. Now indexations and other things. So here in this table, there's no returns. So it tells us that there's something fundamentally happening for the firms. I'm not even sure it's related just to reporting. In fact, I think it probably is not, or at least not fully. And that's the aggregate, the systematic components are becoming more important and more stable. I'm regressing firm level returns on market level risk. So Pengu, I don't follow the comment.
But basically, what I say is, is your aggregate. It's difficult to explain the aggregate earnings in your regression, because your left-hand side is firm level return. The right-hand side, you get to aggregate this earnings. Basically, this aggregate earnings is equivalent to consumption. So actually, you regress, just like you just copy the asset price model. Left-hand side is firm level return. Right-hand side, you get a market level risk. So what we should expect, it has a positive relationship, right?
Oh, yes. So, well, first of all, it doesn't have to be contemporaneous. So there is a lead lag positive as well. But I completely agree. At some point, returns and aggregate earnings should have that positive. But this regression that I'm showing you right now does not have returns. That's exactly what I'm saying. I think this is one of the more important results in the paper, because it takes away from exactly that. It takes away from kind of the risk, just the traditional risk explanations, investors changing their preferences, because this is just earnings. And you can see a changing relation between firm level earnings and aggregate earnings. And also, again, I mean, while I agree that with your sentiment, I don't know why it will be changing over time. So what we're talking about is again, I agree that returns and earnings, at least in maybe a lead lag, but it at some point have to be positive. And I think the literature is overwhelmingly showing that. But the changes over time are not predicted by that preferences. And that's really what we're dealing with. And that's why again, I'll emphasize this slide and this result. When you're looking just on earnings, when you're taking away the returns, you're taking away all the risk preferences of investors, unless if they're incorporated with earnings, which I believe they do at some level. But there's you're not taking, again, these intertemporal changes in risk, because that will take time to get into earnings. So I think that's kind of why I think this result is very important, exactly because I think of your point.
Thank you.
Yes, Jacob. So so in this, so I mentioned this before. Let me go back to some of the points that I've made. So when you move to operating income, we've tried operating income, we've tried analyst forecast errors, we've tried all sorts of stuff. The firm level results, some of the declines that you see are attenuated, usually don't disappear, but are attenuated when you use either operating income or analyst forecast errors, and in some cases almost completely disappearing. I think in the case of analyst forecast errors, completely disappearing. But the aggregate results increasing, those are overwhelming. But you can look at analyst forecast errors and operating income or anything else. So some of the firm level declines that we're seeing, like here in the persistence, are related to those you want to call it transitory items, yes. But definitely the increase is not related to that, and in most cases the trends kind of stay the same. They're just weakened a bit when you take out those quote unquote transitory items in net income, because I think some of them are still in operating income as well. So So again, just to test significance, we run the regressions right over time, and you can see that the persistence of firm level earnings is declining, and the persistence of, I don't know if to use the word persistence exactly here, but the importance, if you want, of aggregate earnings is increasing over time. And again, it's striking the differences. So again, we look at the p-values of the difference, but man, I mean, it's a whole different direction. So I don't know if it's you need the tables to show you that. So what's going on is basically that these abnormal firm level profits, I don't know if to call them abnormal, but any advantage, any good year that you have, basically just disappears pretty quickly. And again, I don't want to state this as if it decays fast. It doesn't. It reverses. So it's not a slow decay. It's not that it's not that the coefficient is lower than 1 and slowly it decays. It's just gone the year afterwards. So it's a very robust negative serial correlation, and it suggests, again, we think it's related to competition, where the firms are just not able to maintain those competitive advantages. It also, I should mention, all of this is true for publicly traded companies. And we know there's been a lot less in the last few years, as we're starting to see some of our trends. A lot of the the market is just not as big. It's been a while since I looked at it, so I think I just looked at it for this paper, and I just saw the decline in the number of publicly traded companies. It is quite striking. So it could be that really what's going on is that the composition of firms is becoming just bigger and more monumental, and that gets us to the hypothesis that we do have. Just to does we relate to some of the comments we had before. We do try a constant sample. We tried quarterly data. Again, it doesn't go as far, but you get more observations. We tried different deflators for earnings to make sure it's not a deflator issue. We did exclude financial institutions. You saw that in some of the tables. Again, using operating income, that's one of the comments that was here. Yeah, we do use analyst forecast. Again, the importance, even in analyst forecast errors, which is quite amazing, the importance of aggregate earnings is increasing over time. And that's one of the, to me, actually, I think we don't tabulate it because of, again, you can see how many figures and tables we already have. But the fact that the analyst forecast, the aggregate is increasing is very telling. Because you can kind of think about it, it's taking away some of just the earnings components out, because it brings out where the analyst expectations are, and you can see that the aggregate is increasing in importance. And we tried positive and negative earnings, but we didn't get much out of that. So what we think is going on is something that has been, I think longer than outer at all. Is it would be to call the superstar firms, and I think this is where I think it does relate to the number of firms publicly traded. We really just have behemoths traded on the stock market, and we've seen that over time. I think there's a Givoli paper, Givoli et al. I think Hain, that they look at what portion of the market is held of the value of the market is held by what portion of the firm, and I think it goes to, I think 10% is now 80 or 90% of the market, or something like that. So it's a very segmented market. And this superstar firm hypothesis basically says that these dominant, actually large growth firms are responsible. It's kind of like a winner take all. These think about Google and Facebook. They're the winners, and they're getting more and more bigger piece of the pie. And in that case, basically, right, they're just if you think about Facebook, where their revenues are from our advertising, they basically have a complete GDP or macro point of view. As long as someone is doing well, as long as the overall market is doing well, their marketing revenues would go up. And the same thing goes for Google and some of those. So it's really, I think, getting towards that. Again, Amazon, a lot of them, and we took this off of the paper, but you can see all the trends there. It's all kind of moving in the same way. All firms, all households with internet, online shopping. Again, one of my students started off with my executive MBA student started off a company that makes cutting boards. He's selling across the U.S. right now. I mean, out of his garage, and so I mean, you definitely see why there could be more systematic components in earnings. So how do we test that that's at least a portion of what's going on? And I think the most natural study, given that the firms talk about the theories talk about large growth firms, is just to examine large growth firms. So we look at we start off by looking at size, and we replicated the analysis that we had of returns on firm level earnings and aggregate earnings, trying to figure out the importance of the firm versus the aggregate. And what we're seeing here, and I think it's quite striking, is the large firms, it's where you see that decline in the importance of idiosyncratic earnings. That trend that we saw on the firm level that it was going down, it's not there for the small firms. It's there for the large firms. The small firms, if anything, it's a bit increasing. So it's not that the firm level become less important. It's just there's a big portion of the capital markets where those firms basically, I don't know how to say it, they're becoming just systematic. And that's where the biggest difference is. If you look at the small versus large firms, you see that the biggest increases, the large firms, again, they're the ones flipping signs from the negative to positive. And you can see in the later periods, kind of, they start aligning. And again, going back to what I believe is, again, one of the more important results is, again, when we take out returns out. So we take out anything related to indexation or people just holding, indexes. So we just look at persistence of earnings, and the decline in persistence, again, is not there for the small firms, which is flat. So there's no decline in the persistence in the firm level earnings. That's always been negative. It's always been they don't get to maintain their competitive advantages. It's the large firms where basically they switch from positive to negative, and towards the end of the period, almost the same as that of the small firms. So that's what we think is striking is, again, those large firms are losing that whatever firm level persistence that they used to have. And what you're seeing here is that they're becoming just more aggregate related. So they're starting to look more like what the small firms look like. And that's why we're start seeing this trends in all the relationships and the earnings returns and everything else. These large firms are becoming just more related to the aggregate and just more and rather than having this negative relation, it's becoming positive and more significant. So what we're seeing is, and I don't think it's I don't think it's accounting related. I can't prove that, but I don't think it's accounting related. There's something fundamentally in the economy that basically means that the firm's relation to each other or the common movement in earnings is becoming more important across firms. Again, at least in publicly traded market, I can't stress that enough. I'm not sure that's true for all the firms, and we do have less publicly traded firms than we ever had, and they're bigger. But basically, what we're seeing is that this aggregate or the co-movement across firms is becoming more and more important. So again, we did the same on growth firms because, again, they talked about large growth firms. And again, you see the same kind of trend. The decline in the earnings returns relation time series, the idiosyncratic component is for the growth firms. It's not there for the value firms, which, if anything, is a little bit increasing again. And again, the growth and value firms are, towards the end of the period are linking up. Basically, what they had a difference in the beginning periods in terms of their importance to the aggregate. They're all moving upwards, which is, again, that's an important trend, but they're also linking up. And again, this goes back to, we're seeing the same thing on persistence. The biggest decline in persistence is for the growth firms, although there is some of the value firms as well. And the importance of the aggregate is, again, rising for both, but it's, again, linking up and becoming more important over time. So again, this is one of the reasons why when we run cross-sectional regressions and we're missing a piece of information. And especially when if I go back to the original point that I was trying to make in the paper, is that you need to look at all three relationships: the aggregate, the firm level cross-sectional, and the firm level time series. You have to look at all of them, because again, when the aggregate is becoming more important, the cross-sectional, I don't want to say by definition, doesn't have to be, but could definitely go down. And that's one of the things that we're missing when we just run these cross-sectional regressions or even just time series. You really need to look at the whole thing to figure out what's going on. And I think that's kind of our main point in the paper. When you do look at all of them, you get a better and more complete picture of how things change over time. And again, as I said, I'm not even, we spend a lot of time talking about how accounting changes things and rules change things. And I'm not sure, for example, the relationship that we see here has anything to do with accounting. And that's why I think the analyst forecast is error is very important. Even there, the aggregate is becoming more important, where a lot of those maybe accounting issues are already taken into account by the analysts. So I do think that's kind of one of the things that are important.
Gil, yeah, Young has a question.
Yeah, let me read. So Hyung, I actually don't know how to measure what the information content of aggregate earnings is, was it cash flow or discount rate news. I mean, I know there's the studies that try and do that, but the problem with those studies is that they keep the model stable over time, and we can see that there's changes over time. So that's why and cash flows are residual. So when they predict less returns, that comes out as cash flows. So I'm not sure that it's true that aggregate earnings include more cash flow news. But I can say something about persistence, but I'm not sure about whether it's cash flow news and firm level news. And as a more broad point, I would say, I think that's a missing point of the literature in terms of what about firm level earnings and earnings in general. What do they mean about risk and returns? I think I don't think there's a lot of work on that at all. In fact, I don't know. I don't know, for example, if expected earnings and expected returns on the firm level are positive or negative, or maybe different in different states, and on all of the above. So I think your point is actually a very big one, but I don't think we know that much right now, and I'm not sure I'm comfortable saying that aggregate earnings now include more cash flows than discount rate news. I don't know that at all. In fact, I don't know what discount rate news are in earnings at all either. So I think that's a big point, but I don't know the answer to those.
But aggregate earnings were negative. So it's because of discount rate news in earnings. It's related to Kothar's paper, but now it's positive. It means it includes more cash flow news.
Well, if it was discount rate news, then the analyst forecast errors would have been negative too, but they're positive throughout the sample period. You could look at the paper that I have with Alon Kalai and Jung Ho Choi. I mean, it's positive throughout. I mean, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it might be true, but I mean, if I knew how to measure it, that would be fine. I mean, there's no paper that actually shows that earnings is positively related to discount rate news that in a way that we all agree that that's discount rate news, because we don't know how to measure that. It's all conjectures based on the relationships that we find. And I would mention even more, there's a paper in JFQA, Hyung Lai, I forgot who the other author is. Even when you take out all the, so they just did the time series analysis to create aggregate time series shocks, and that relationship turns positive already. So even when you just use time series shocks on aggregate earnings, you can flip the relationship to be positive from 1970 to 2000, when the Kothari and Warner sample was. So it's very difficult for me to make that claim. I mean, I'm not saying it's not. I'm not clear. I mean, it's a mess. Again, the idea that it's switched, I'm not sure. Thank you, Jeremiah. I don't remember if we tried some of that. I think I need to look. I think in terms of earnings at the firm level, I think they remained. I need to look at it. We need to look at just earnings levels. I don't know if we did it in this analysis, but we can look and see what we find. We do find some of the anyway. Thanks, Jeremiah. I think we can run it. I think we can test it. So again, for the interest of time, I'm gonna talk a little bit about, but I won't spend much time on these trends. It's working the same way that you see in the graphs. For example, for the large firms, that when you see the firm level earnings going down and the aggregate going up, and again, the firm level earnings persistence is again going down. So we get those differences between large small firms and growth and value. Really what we wanted to show you is that those differences are significant, and they are, but I think the figures can show that. So one other thing we did about the superstar firm, and I'll try and conclude in time, is instead of, if it's right, the superstar firm hypothesis is right, we should be taking the larger firms as an aggregate, and that should work. And it's consistently it looks exactly the same as when we used aggregate earnings instead. So you can start seeing that basically the 25 and 50 largest 50 firms capture the exact same trends. So it's kind of, it's consistent with that. Again, I don't know if I like the name, but it's called the superstar firm hypothesis. I'm using it too, but that's what it is. We tried other things, seasoned versus newly listed firms. We didn't find a lot of differences, and we tried new economy industries. We again, as I said, it doesn't seem to be explaining our results. So again, in conclusion, I think to say that the earnings returns relation has declined over time, and I take Stephen's point, it's not accounting overall declining, but it is, again, earnings returns, that the fact that it has declined over time, I think that's not exactly true, but it's definitely changed. So the earnings returns relation is not what we learned back then over time, so it's very different now. And what we're seeing is that the idiosyncratic earnings are less persistent, the whole firm level analysis is becoming, I shouldn't say less relevant, I don't know what the word I would use, but the firm level performances are less stationary, and competitive advantages disappear very quickly. On the other side, the aggregate is becoming more important in understanding how firms do. So if we're teaching valuation, we're teaching about forecasting, and we used to basically use firm level analysis. Our study suggests if you're teaching valuation, you should really start teaching your students, again, the importance of the aggregate and understanding how the firm would do. Again, I don't think this is just an accounting topic. I think it's more of a broader economics. The aggregate is becoming more important. So if we're trying to forecast, if we're trying to understand how the firm will do, understanding the macroeconomic conditions is becoming more, not less important, at the very least for these publicly traded companies. And more broadly, I think, I think, there's two components to the paper. One is conceptual, on how to measure like things like earnings returns relation, but it doesn't just apply to earnings returns relation. If you think about a lot of our studies on accruals, we have accrual reversal, and yet our studies, accrual reverse is a firm level time series phenomenon. Accruals don't reverse in the cross section; they reverse in firm level time series, and yet a lot of our analysis is done cross sectionally. I think there's a lot of analysis that needs to be done in different ways in order for us to reach the correct conclusions in terms of how we analyze earnings returns and other relationships overall. Again, even without any of the data that I'm showing you, I think that point is actually valid and important. So thanks all of you for spending this hour with me. And for those of you who didn't see Jake Thomas's text earlier, D-Sol is David Solomon. D-Sol is his DJ stage name. He's actually, surprisingly enough, a good, successful DJ. So for those of you who want to know, that's what he is. David Solomon is D-Sol.
Sounds great. All right. Thanks a lot, Gil. Really appreciate you joining us. And, you know,
thank you, Salman.
That, you know, next week, Shiva Rajagopal, Anup Srivastava, and Rong Zhao will present their paper on do technology firms generate excess profits. So please check the website for the Accounting Design Project to get latest updates on future events. All right, guys, have a great week ahead.
Yep. Thanks for all the help, Salman. Appreciate it.
Yep, my pleasure.
Thanks, Stephen and Ayung, for organizing all of it.